This video focuses on Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Sonnets from the Portuguese and Robert Browning's My Last Duchess. This is an image of the two of them early in their courtship. I wanted to start by giving you a little bit of information about their relationship and how that impacted their poetry. They met when Elizabeth was 39 years old. She was actually 6 years older than Robert, and at the time she was a well-known poet. He fell in love with her poetry, fell in love with her through her poetry, and he wanted to meet her. She was living a very protective life at home. Her father was particularly overly protective of her, and because she had been living such an isolated life, she had become a semi-invalid. And her father did not approve of her relationship with Robert, but he swept her off her feet. They fell in love, they eloped, they moved to Italy, they married and had a son, and she regained her health, and they enjoyed a happy marriage for 15 years until her death in 1861. Her Sonnets from the Portuguese, she wrote the poems in this collection during their courtship, but her husband did not see the poems until 3 years after the marriage and after the birth of their son. The story goes that one day they were talking and she said, "Oh, didn't I show you those poems that I wrote when we were courting?" And she dug them up and showed them to him. So it's not as if she was keeping them from him intentionally, but she pulled them out. They were collected into a book that was highly popular. The title of the poem Sonnets from the Portuguese was intended to add a quality to the poems to make them more marketable. That is, to show them as sonnets that were actually translated from the Portuguese. The, I guess, exoticness of them being translated was something that appealed to readers, but it also hid the identity of her as a woman of the time period. Ultimately, though, her identity was revealed. And the poems are different too, because she takes on a sort of courtly lover role, rather than essentially she's the one who makes the moves, rather than the traditional reverse. The poems in the collection are Italian sonnets. You see the rhyme scheme that I have identified here. This is an Italian sonnet. All of the 44 poems in the collection are sonnets. I've only asked you to read 4 of them, but it is a much longer book. Some of the topics that she addresses in the poems that we have that I asked you to read, the persona asks the lover to speak of his love and asks her lover to feel their love to the very depths of his being. She also, in her poems, suggests, there can be some doubt in a love relationship, and she questions too, can love move a little bit too quickly? Sonnet 43 is the specific sonnet I would like to focus on, and this is the one that I will hold you responsible for. This is the sonnet that is her most famous. It's as if the poem is set in the middle of a conversation. Notice that the sonnet opens with the question, "How do I love thee?" It sounds as if the poem is the persona is responding to something that someone else has said to her, suggesting that the other person is wondering about how she loves him. And the poem is the response. Notice the repetition of I love thee over and over again. The poem is about the wonders of love. The persona elevates her lover to the sort of level of being like a savior who has done everything for her. He is her smiles, her tears. She loves him with every breath that she has. And even after death, the assumption is that their love will continue then. I wanted to show you too an example, and I'm back to showing you examples of how I might frame a paper if I were writing one about a topic of one of the readings for the semester. And I came across this article by going to the library homepage about Elizabeth Barrett Browning and the female troubadour tradition. And I thought that this was an interesting article that might give me an interesting approach to the poem. This is one of the pages from the article. The writer gives an overview of what other people have been saying about her poems, about her Browning's sonnets, saying that an EBB is the Elizabeth Barrett Browning. The writer here uses her initials. But I'd call your attention to here, EBB, by taking on both traditional male and female roles as both lover and beloved, can also be seen to be following this practice of the female troubadour, the female courtly lover. But ultimately, she says here, the writer says here, EBB is demonstrably breaking out of this tradition and forging a new poetic female expression for mutual love and desire. And I think I would be very interested in pursuing this, not only to look at the way that the poems here sort of subvert the traditional role of the male being the courtly lover, the one who makes the moves, in other words, but also the poems suggest an equality between the lovers and show their mutual love and desire. In other words, it's not one-sided. I think this would be really interesting to apply to the poems, and I would go through the poems and look for specific examples that I thought would help me in supporting a claim that I would develop there. Now, the Robert Browning poem that I wanted you all to take a look at, let's get back to that. Well, just a few more things too about her literary reputation. She was considered for poet laureate, but was not chosen. Her poems oftentimes have been very much connected with the biographical information, the story about her relationship with her husband. And for that reason, there hasn't been as much focus on the quality and depth of her poems. But increasingly, though, there has been more and more interest in her work, particularly through the lens of gender and the fact, too, that she often wrote of social justice issues. Now, with Robert Browning's poetry, My Last Duchess is one of his really well-known poems. This is a dramatic monologue. And we saw a dramatic monologue earlier with the Tennyson. The poem is written in heroic couplets. That is, couplet being two. If you look at the poem, the end rhymes are wall, call, hand, stand, said, and read, and so on. And this is just a form that's referred to as the heroic couplet. It's oftentimes equated with texts topics more related to heroism, to put it in a short and sweet. Here, what's really interesting about this poem is the narrator of the poem. He tells the story of his last Duchess. The narrator is a duke, and the story is of what happens here is actually, as you see from the notes at the bottom of the page, based in some actual history that Browning knew about. This is one of the poems that I think reflects one of the qualities that's suggested in the biographical information. He was interested in exposing the devious ways in which our minds work. The narrator prompts us to ask some questions about him. What story does the Duke believe he's telling? He seems to believe that he is telling a story to the person who's listening. And the person who's listening is the emissary of another wealthy guy who has a daughter who is of marriageable age and seems to be potential for the Duke's next Duchess. He is a widower at this point he's looking for a new wife. The Duke believes he is representing himself as someone who is highly esteemed, who has a lot of money, who has high standing, and is worthy of this other rich person's daughter's hand in marriage. The story that is implied, though, is that the Duke is actually someone who psychologically abused his last Duchess, his last wife, who actually even had her killed. There is reference to him being very jealous even of her talking with other people, other men. But the suggestion that he had her murdered comes in the description of the painting that is done of her by Frey Pandolf. There is a half flush that dies along her throat, the poem tells us. This is a suggestion that the Duke, who would not have done this physically, he would not have killed her, but he had someone else do it. But the suggestion is that she was strangled. He wants to marry this next time, so he's thinking about how he represents himself, showing off his wealth. The place in which the conversation is happening to is a more private space. It's a room upstairs in his home. He has a painting of the last Duchess that he has covered with a wall hanging, and he can pull aside the wall hanging to show off the portrait of him whenever he wants to. Doing so suggests the power that he has over her even in her death. This is not a narrator that we should trust, in other words. It's a really interesting poem to look at because of the fact of the narrator. I would add, though, oftentimes this poem is seen as one that's really interesting and intriguing to try to figure it out. Our book refers to the pleasures of the poem. Increasingly, though, I have been reminded when I read this poem, it is about a man who hasn't murdered his wife, which is obviously unconscionable. For Browning, looking toward modernism, his experimentation, his prosiness, his psychological interest all make him things that are ones that qualify him for being connected with modernism, looking ahead to the 20th century, even though he is obviously writing in the mid 19th.